But let's start with the origins of sports car racing and the role that you played in the beginnings of it, and specifically here in Watkins Glen.
Well, it's been said that I had a new MG and wanted a place to race it, which is true. I acquired the MG in January of '48, but we'd been thinking about it and planning it for a little time before that. And I lived in Youngstown, Ohio, and my wife and I lived there. And I had grown up there, but spent about half my life up here, so I knew these roads very well. And we laid that course out on the living room rug every night, and Gene picked it up every morning all winter. And then I got the MG, so that made it a little more urgent. And I spoke to an old friend, a man named Arthur Richards, who was the local reporter for our county for the Elmira Star-Gazette and other papers. And he had a lot of imagination and was willing to take a lot of risks. He thought it sounded wonderful, and he talked to Don Brubaker, and you may have met him here. He was president of the Chamber of Commerce, which was a very lucky thing, because he could see the possibilities. And the two of them first presented it to the Chamber and convinced them. And they wrote to me and said, bring on the cars. And I'd been what they called a subscriber member of SCCA, the Sports Car Club of America, for a couple of years. And became a full-fledged member when I got the MG, because one had to have a sports car to be a member. So anyway, the SCCA then president, Russ Seeley, thought it sounded like a wonderful idea, and that SCCA would support it. They had, since the resumption of racing at Indianapolis after World War II, an annual trek to Indianapolis. This was only the third one, I guess, because we're talking about *48. And I went out there in my MG. Gene and I went out there in the MG. Bill Milliken was there with his Bugatti, and a lot of other people. Charlie Adams of New Yorker fame with his Mercedes, and quite a lot of others. Anyway, at a dinner the night before the race, I presented the idea to the Sports Car Club of America. It was very small then, and probably 3/4 of the members were present. And they applauded and cheered and jumped up and down, and when I asked for a show of hands, a very large number responded. And that, of course, was the night before the Indianapolis race, so that had to be May 29th of 1948. And then things moved very rapidly, and we had the first organizational meeting here on June 10th, and I showed them the circuit, and some of them couldn't believe it, but they thought it was, and it really was a classic circuit, the original one. I'll match it against even the Nürburgring. And it went on from there. I was chosen to be general race chairman for representing both the SCCA and the village of Watkins Glen. A local chairman was appointed, a man named Leon Groshon. We found a section in the New York State statutes that permitted closing roads for racing under certain conditions. And we had to convince 8 entities, 7 political subdivisions, that we should do this, and they all had to sign a permit. And if I can remember all of them, there was the state of New York, there was the county of Schuyler, the village of Watkins Glen, the town of Reading, and the town of Dix, Finger Lake State Park Commission, New York State Park Commission, and then we had the New York Central Railroad problem. But the mayor of Watkins Glen, he was a brave man, and he got around in a motorized wheelchair. And his best friend was the superintendent of the New York Central Railroad for this area, and they stopped the trains. So it happened on October 2nd. And I continued as general race chairman for 48, 9, and 50. Then I was away from it for a couple of years. I was finishing law school. I was in law school. And then, well, essentially from 53 through 70, I ran it for about 23 years. And after that, Mal Curry succeeded me, and he's the man I gave you the card about the film. And what else can I tell you? What would you like to know?
Did you know the Collier brothers?
Oh, yeah, very well. They were wonderful, both of them. Wonderful men, and such fine race drivers, and such great guys.
So what are some of the standout stories that just keep popping up over the years?
Oh, there are all kinds of stories, and not necessarily significant. Some of them are amusing, and of course, you know, there are all kinds of tales. One favorite is, I think it was the 1949 race. Driver in an MG. Have you been around the course, the original? Coming up out of White's Hollow after Stonebridge, and it goes like it S's, and off to the right. I don't know if you realize it or not. It drops down 300 feet, and there are trees to stop you. And this MG went off and was wedged against the tree. And so it was only off the road a few yards. Emergency people were trying to get this guy out of the car because they were afraid the car would go over any minute. And he was yelling at him, and they finally communicated. It seemed he had a wooden leg, and he had his left foot strapped to the clutch because it's kind of hard to stab for the clutch, and you have to do a lot of shifting. So they couldn't pull him out until they cut the tape. So that's one of my favorite ones. But they got him out. And I remember another old friend wasn't satisfied with the car he had, and he borrowed a Jaguar XK120. That would have been about 1950. And coming up out of White's Hollow, a lot of things happened into and out of White's Hollow. There used to be a big tree right at straight ahead, and then you made left turn. And he didn't make it, so he bought this Jaguar right on the spot from the guy who'd loaned it to him. So, you know, there were lots of funny things like that. But it did endure. And I'd like to say that we called it the Watkins Glen Sports Car Grand Prix, knowing full well that what Grand Prix meant. We took poetic license quite deliberately, and it did capture the imagination of the local fans and powers that be. But I always hoped, and this is a fact, and I imagine it's documented, I know it is, I always hoped that someday we would have the American Grand Prix. There was not one in this country. Well, ultimately, 1961 and through 80, we did get the United States Grand Prix for Formula One, for the World Championship. So our sights were set pretty high. And the thing that pleases me, among the things that pleases me most, because there are an awful lot of things, looking back on it, is that always, starting in 48, and right through and to the present day, Watkins Glen has had the state-of-the-art, best racing cars and drivers that were at the time. They were all here, and they've all been here over the years. And I won't go through the litany, but all of them, from Mario Andretti and Graham Hill and A.J. Foyt and Miles Collier and all the world champions. And anyway, that pleases me as much as anything.
When you were deciding on setting up the track, the route, what were some of the things you were taking into consideration?
Oh, there were a number of things, of course. The first and foremost, I suppose, was getting permission so we actually could do it. And that was proceeding well, and then we had the railroad crossing problem that I mentioned, and that was solved. Paramount concern was safety. And, you know, Miles Collier said, we're worried about spectators. We don't care about drivers. We wear hard hats. And but spectator safety was the main concern, and it was a very difficult thing to bring about. I think spectator safety has evolved to a point where it is as safe as it can be, but there's always that nightmare fear that some car is going to get loose, because cars do strange things at 150 mile an hour and over if they get loose. In the early days, we had snow fencing, most places, but keeping the crowds back from the race course and the danger areas. Those were not barriers, of course, that would stop a car, but they were a line of demarcation. But we found a lot of property owners, including farmers out in the country and business people in town, said, we don't want you to put up those fences. We want to sell people permission to sit in our ditch or in our wheat field. We're going to do it, and you go jump. So, of course, in 1952, there was a tragic accident downtown, and a little boy was killed. A number of people were hurt. And after that, the circuit moved up. It's run continuously. But in 53, it moved out to an interim circuit. I call it interim because in 50.
Why don't we just wait till this car?
I think we were talking about safety and the accident downtown, and the circuit moved up on the hill, and we had a new 4.6-mile circuit, which was used for 3 years. But one of the things we accomplished when we got up on the hill, we leased the land on both sides of the road, 4.6 miles, both sides, for, I won't do that back to him. We leased the land on both sides of the road for 500 feet back, so we could put genuine safety barriers in and keep the crowds. And so for the first time, we had genuine crowd control. In the early days, the first year, the paper said there were 10,000 people here in 1948. That more than doubled the following year. And Wilbur Shaw, who had won Indianapolis 3 years and was president of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, was here as an honorary, as a guest and honorary marshal. And he was just amazed and terribly impressed with the huge crowd. And at that time, Indianapolis was talking about 225, 250,000 people. Somebody said, "Mr. Shaw, you think there are 100,000 people here?" And he said, "No," he said, "How many people do you think are here?" And he said, maybe 100,000. Couldn't be more than that, which was half of what Indianapolis was getting. Well, of course, there weren't 100,000 people that year, but we never were able to count them because the original course was 6.6 miles, and they were all around it. In 50, my father and I drove the pace car in the first race on the pace lap. So I was able to see at a moderate speed. I later raced in the Grand Prix the same day, but at a moderate speed, the crowds, and they were incredible. And of course, it scared me a little bit because they were in obvious places that could be dangerous. And we weren't able to really solve that until we got out of town. Then, of course, when the permanent circuit was built, we put in guardrails and knock on wood, I don't think there's been a spectator accident since here.
On the original track, what would you say some of the average speeds were?
Well, the record was just it was 6.6 miles, and the record was held by Phil Walters, who drove for Briggs Cunningham, and it was, I think, 2 seconds under 5 minutes. It was 80.0, 80 mile an hour average flat, and that was the record. And of course, the hill, you've been around the course, so you know how steep the hill is going out of town. That really slowed down smaller engine cars like MGs and that engine size class. Of course, I could make it up coming downhill. The car would stay together. There are lots of pieces of engine probably still up on that hillside because a lot of cars blew up. And when a car blows up, literally, they blow up. Pieces of the engine block and connecting rods and all kinds of things fly out.
Still up there today.
Probably some of them are still buried in the mud. It's been terribly exciting for all these years, and I was privileged to run it for 23 years, and then I went on and ran SCCA for another 7 years, and after 30 years in motor racing, came back and to the real world, resumed the practice of law. So that's my tale.
That's a great tale.
And I don't know, about Bill Milliken, I don't know what stories he told. I have a lot of stories, and I'm not going to tell them. But I will tell you this, and they're all favorable. He is one great race driver. And the last time I raced, he and I co-drove my Alfa Romeo at Sebring. And we finished fourth, and he's terrific in every way.
All right.
Did you have any other race circuit in mind when you designed this and laid it out, or was it...
This one seemed to be the perfect one, and I still believe it was. However, when I was showing the circuit to Bill Milliken and others from SCCA, and of course the local people, I had alternatives to show them. None of them were comparable. One was up on the hill. I don't know whether you're familiar with the country around here at all, but there's a road along that ridge from Montour Falls to Burdett. I call it Skyline Drive, and I had in mind a combination up there. And I had another one in mind that wouldn't have gone through the village. But I must say the people in Watkins Glen liked the idea of it going through the village, as I did.
Well, what I was thinking of is this was the first road racing circuit in the United States. Is that correct?
That's right, first road racing circuit in the United States.
Are you thinking of some tracks in England or something when you the idea?
I named one of the corners or one of the bends on this course after a bend in a track in England. I had in mind a lot of circuits in Europe, which at that time I hadn't actually seen. I've been to all of them since, but I knew of them. I'd read a great deal about them, and I had letters from people who were there. And of course, we patterned it after European road racing.
Okay, that'll be helpful. Thank you.
Because as you all know, after World War I, racing diverged. There had been road races in this country before World War I on Long Island and Savannah, Georgia, and other places. But racing in this country became, certainly all professional racing, was oval track racing, from Indianapolis down to Fairgrounds. And the Europeans went the way of the road races. And most of them between the wars and for quite a while after the Second World War were true road courses, like Le Mans. The Nürburgring was a true road course, although it was built by German as a way to employ people during the huge depression about 1925 in Germany through the Eifel Mountains. But it was built and did resemble ordinary roads, and people pay a couple of marks and drive around it to this day. And it's generally regarded as the classic and greatest road racing circuit in the world. And I think this one is a worthy contender for the, not second, I think it stands equal with the Nürburgring.
Were you looking for a mix of straightaways, hills, curves, S's,
Yeah, we
gravel, paved?
Well, wasn't particularly looking for gravel paved, a mix of that, but I was looking for uphill, downhill, curves, straightaways.
I told you if you ever got him started, you know.
He's good.
He's good, isn't
You're
he?
good, and I'm going to be back in touch with you.
But don't let this guy go until you get the full poop.
I think she's got the thing under control.
I think she is too.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm enjoying it with this lovely lady. As I say, the pavement wasn't something I thought particularly about. It just happened. That part of it was concrete, part of it was asphalt, macadam, part of it was dirt. But we did look for uphill, downhill, rights and lefts, and hairpins, and the stone bridge was marvelous. Incidentally, the dirt portion, there's more dirt in 1948, well, through 52 than there is today. But the county highway superintendent, a man named Ernie Porter, he just became so enthused, and he graded and smoothed and oiled that dirt, and the oil was put on. He was highly skilled, so none of it bled back, and the cars didn't get covered with black muck. But the dirt portion was the widest and smoothest part of the entire race, and the road now is, it's a country dirt road. It was then, but he widened it for the race so that it was probably 60 feet wide. Certainly more than 50 being the normal right-of-way. And it was tremendous. That long run down into the railroad crossing, for instance, that was one of the fastest parts of the race course. And then the same Ernie Porter persuaded the Department of Public Works, it was called then, now it's the DOT, to pave a portion that had been planned for 1952. And after the 48 race, he got him to do it prior to the 49 race. And it started at the village limits and went up across the long, under the railroad underpass and clear up to where you dive down into Stone Bridge. And that was all done several years in advance. And I always said that Ernie Porter contributed to the increase in lap speeds as much as Mr. Ferrari and Goodyear tires and whoever.